The Transcendentalists believe that the individual self is a manifestation of the universal mind or soul, the oversoul, Ralph Waldo Emerson called it. In other words, there's a spark of the divine in each of us. They are the mystical branch of our Unitarian Universalist tradition and include UU luminaries like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Theodore Parker, and Margaret Fuller, just to name a few. Most of them write of and reflect on their mystical experiences as what Abraham Maslow might have called peak experiences that defined the trajectory of their lives. Theirs was a grounded, social reform-minded mysticism that prioritized reverence for nature, appreciation for the wonder and mystery in the mundane, and encouragement of spiritual seeking, as well as discovery of the universal wisdom in all world religions. Now, direct experiences of the transcending mystery and wonder are unfortunately transient in nature. So to improve the odds of having and sustaining such experiences, the Transcendentalists constructed their daily rounds to provide fertile soil for direct contact with the spirit of life and allow time for incorporation and distillation of those experiences into their life and into their work. The Transcendentalists called this practice self-culture. Let me pause here and say that the Transcendentalists, for all their combined wordsmithing abilities, were really terrible at naming things. And they would take words that meant one thing to most people and alchemize them and then plop them into their publications for posterity to be misunderstood by generations to come. Their phrase self-culture, for example, to them meant a lifelong spiritual discipline of fostering and refining the individual's connection to the spirit of life and deepening the character and congruence of one's own self or soul. And importantly, they meant for the wisdom derived from self-culture to be applied to society. For example, Henry David Thoreau's pursuit of self-culture led first to his 2-year retreat to Walden Pond, which allowed him to grow into himself enough to produce his radical writing on civil disobedience. In secular terms, self-culture was the means the Transcendentalists used to forge, grow, and maintain moral character. That's what they meant. But the term they chose, self-culture, it sounds super self-absorbed, doesn't it? A little individualistic and elitist, which unfortunately has led many modern seekers to spurn this rich subset of UU spirituality. I hope to open it up for y'all today. The rise of the Transcendentalist movement in the 1820s smacked into the tail of the Industrial Revolution. And the Transcendentalists despaired at the changes that industrialization and urbanization brought to spiritual life in America. The rising tide of consumerism, materialism, and capitalism fragmented the Transcendentalist goal of a whole soul or an undivided self. The intellect could not fix the cracks in humanity brought by this new and unnatural way of living. The Transcendentalists, in their wisdom, prescribed a spiritual balm. In reaction to the industrialization of their day, Transcendentalist spiritual practices emphasize taking space away from the hubbub. And for this reason, I think that Transcendentalist spiritual practices translate particularly well to us in the current world order of social distancing, which will likely remain until there's a wide dispensation of a COVID-19 vaccine. Elevating our souls requires us to slow down, simplify our lives, and take time away from crowds. We indeed live in a unique moment in history where Transcendentalist wisdom and CDC guidance overlap. So 2 things undergird Transcendentalist spiritual practices: nature and leisure. To the transcendentalists, nothing lays the foundation for a direct encounter with the spirit of life quite like nature. For them, nature replaced scripture as the primary source of religious revelation. Nature short circuits overthinking, which can sometimes be a problem for us Unitarian Universalists, and it reconnects us experientially and sensorially to reverence and to wonder. When we're out in nature and we witness how one leaf connects to a tree, or how one drop of water falls from the larger cloud, and a myriad other examples of the ecosystem, we humans have a chance to intuitively grasp what we all too often have consciously forgotten, that we are part and parcel of a universal spirit, one with all that is. My sense is that many have been turning to nature during this time for peace and to feel connected to something greater, even if you're alone in the outdoors. I wonder what the world would be like if we kept that understanding and awareness of nature as essential to our well-being, kept it at the forefront of our awareness, even after the world opens up again. The second underpinning of transcendentalist spiritual practice is their concept of leisure. Here again, we have a word sacred to transcendentalists that has different, more negative connotations for some of us. Some raised in a Protestant work ethic might equate leisure with loafing or slacking, eliminating responsibilities that we need to be attending to. We might think of leisure as something only available to the well-off, but not so for the transcendentalists. Leisure to them was akin to the Sabbath. It amounted to building in unstructured time necessary for spiritual flourishing. In this way, their word leisure, it didn't translate to hobbies or recreation. Those are necessary, they're necessary respites from work, but those things are much more active than transcendentalist leisure. Henry David Thoreau describes leisure as a broad margin in his life, saying in Walden, "There were times when I could not afford to sacrifice the bloom of the present moment to any work, whether of the head or the hands. I love a broad margin of leisure to my life. Sometimes in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise to noon, wrapped in reverie." Leisure, Aristotle says, is freedom from the necessity of being occupied by other things. It feels like stolen time. My favorite transcendentalist scholar, the Reverend Barry Andrews, boldly asserts that creative work, meaningful relationships, and peace of mind can only be accomplished with a broad margin of leisure. My sense is that leisure's been on the upswing for many of us during the pandemic. Obligations, appointments, and activities that usually keep us hurrying from thing to thing have been canceled or minimized or moved online. Hidden spans of time in the day where there once was none have been created when we would otherwise have been probably driving hither and thither. I wonder what the world would be like if we kept leisure after we vanquished COVID-19. From these underpinnings of nature and leisure, transcendentalists peppered their days with spiritual practices. I'll highlight 3 this morning. Solitude stands out as relevant for us today, I think. Emerson started his day with a slice of pie and 2 cups of coffee, and then he would retire alone to his study until lunch to work. In the afternoon, he took long walks alone, but he was hardly a hermit. He lived with his family, and he entertained lots of visitors, And indeed, he made his living mostly on the lecture circuit. But still, he jealously guarded his solitude, saying, "Solitude is not, and society is not. Alternate them, and the good of each is seen. You can soon learn all that society can teach you for one while, then retire and hide. Have solitary prayer and praise. Love the garden, the barn, the pasture, and the rock. There, digest and correct past experience. Blend it with new and divine life, and grow with God. After some interval, when these delights have been sucked dry, accept again the opportunities of society. The same scenes revisited shall wear a new face, shall yield a higher culture." Thoreau treasured the 2 years he spent on Walden Pond, living alone in the 10 by 15-foot house that he built on land gifted from Emerson. He had contemplated the move for years, working odd jobs while he pondered it. Reading the book he wrote about his time there, Walden, the reader can hear the change in Thoreau from the early chapters to the last. His disposition gentles, and his voice takes on a wondering, poetic slant. It was a transformative experience for him, launching his career as a writer, but more importantly, helping him find his voice as a person. But like Emerson, his solitude was not unbroken, even while he was living alone at Walden Pond. It was really more of an extended spell of social distancing, you might say. He walked to his family's house and Emerson's house for supper regularly and conversation. There's rumors that he took his laundry to his mom. He helped out others with work that needed doing. He apparently went to Maine for a few weeks for a little vacation away from his staycation. He reports that he actually had more visitors while he lived at Walden Pond than at any other period in his life. Solitude is not the same as isolation. Solitude is a respite, a way to resource ourselves so that we can return to society enriched. Parker Palmer, Quaker educator and author, puts it this way: "The only thing we have to bring to a community is ourselves. So the contemplative process of recovering our true selves in solitude is never selfish. It's ultimately the best gift we can give others." I wonder if y'all have, as I have, experienced the transcendentalist sense of solitude during the pandemic as we stay home to stay safe. I wonder what the world would be like if, after the pandemic, we kept solitude and abandoned busyness. In addition to solitude, the Transcendentalists set great store by conversation. Not idle talk, but splendid discussions, respectful, deep, and earnest. Such speech, they thought, midwives an awareness of the spirit of life in our midst, and the whole of the conversation becomes much, much greater than the sum of its parts. Emerson preached that in all conversations between two persons, tacit reference is made as to a third party, to a common nature. And that third party or common nature is not social, it is impersonal, is God. And so in groups where debate is earnest, and especially on high questions, the company becomes aware that the thought rises to an equal level in all bosoms, that all have a spiritual property in what was said. They all become wiser than they were. It arches over them like a temple, this unity of thought in which every heart beats with a nobler sense of power and duty, and thinks and acts with unusual solemnity. All are conscious of attaining to a higher self-possession. It shines for us all. Margaret Fuller led a series of conversations for women at Elizabeth Peabody's Boston bookstore that functioned as feminist consciousness raising. She guided the discussions with an ear to two questions. What were we born to do, and how shall we do it? The Transcendentalist spiritual practice of conversation is not for the faint of heart. These conversations open cracks of change in your soul and plant seeds of social revolution. The final Transcendentalist spiritual practice that I'll highlight today is reading. Universalist and Transcendentalist Theodore Parker spent most of his preaching money on books and taught himself 3 languages so he could expand his literary horizons. When he died, his books became the core collection of the new Boston Public Library. Margaret Fuller is said to be the most well-read woman of her time in America, reading and translating works in Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and German. She edited the Transcendentalist magazine, The Dial, and she guided America's literary selections when she worked as a book critic for the New York Tribune. Thoreau said, "Books are the treasured wealth of the world and the fit inheritance of generations and nations." Though they read widely, the Transcendentalists also read carefully, cognizant that their time was simply limited. Emerson once calculated that a person could spend 60 years reading from dawn till dusk and die only a few shelves into the entire Paris library. The best books, according to Emerson, are those that impart sympathetic activity to the moral power and stimulate the imagination. Sacred writings from all over the world make the cut for the Transcendentalists, as do poetry and philosophy, almost all the classics. But worthwhile reading isn't limited to these by any means. Skim for lusters when you read. That's what Emerson called the parts that attract our attention and ring startling truth to that inner ear. Reading that inspires us and opens us to new perspectives, it's a form of worship, I think. I wonder what books form the creases of your lives, ushering in new eras of being and forever marking you. I wonder what each of you has read lately that felt like that. And I wonder what transformative tomes have been calling to you. Like meditation, Transcendentalist spiritual practices are simple, but not easy. Undergirded by nature and leisure, they form the backbone of the lifetime work of self-culture. The yield of self-culture ripples out to transform society. We have a unique opportunity during this pandemic to ask ourselves, which aspects of this pared down lifestyle would we keep, even if it were safe to live as we had before? The answer to that question probably would fall among the array of Transcendentalist spiritual practices. The Transcendentalist gospel includes the idea that standard of living and quality of life are not the same. Too often, they tell us, we trade the latter for the former. For quality of life, seed your days with windows of opportunity for contact with the direct experience of the transcending mystery, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness of the forces which create and uphold life. Amen, and blessed be.